Thank you very much. So you're very welcome to the Quay venue. I'm Charles Duggan, I'm the Heritage Officer in Dublin City Council. We'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening for what will be a very wonderful lecture by Dr. Deirdre Foley. So tonight's talk, Women and Girls in Jacob's Biscuit Factory 1911 to 1977, explores experiences of female workers in one of Dublin's most significant industrial employers, examining issues of gender, class and workplace inequality. The lecture is the first in our 2026 series. Please take note on the screen of the other lectures that are taking place between now and June. And just to point out that all the lectures that will take place here, with the exception of the June talk by Andrew Delaney on queer Georgians, which will take place in the amazing surroundings of 12 Henrietta Street. So that is definitely not one to miss. And so if you've missed any of our talks, you can watch them back on our YouTube channel. It's just Dublin City Heritage. So this is our third year of the series. So there's an awful lot of talks from this series, but also our symposia that we've run over the years. So delve in and out, and please up our statistics of viewership, because that's really important. The series is an initiative of the Dublin City Strategic Heritage Plan, and it's made possible through funding from the Heritage Council. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to acknowledge those who've made this evening possible. First, a sincere thanks to my colleague Abigail O'Reilly, who's Graduate Heritage Officer. You'll have met her at the door. She's been instrumental in organising this series, and I'd also like to express my gratitude to Cormac Leonard and Orla McCabe, who are providing sign language interpretation this evening, ensuring that the series is accessible to everybody. So now on to our speaker. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Deirdre Foley. Dr. Foley is an historian of modern Ireland with a particular interest in the legal and social status of women in 20th century Ireland. She's a former Roy Foster Irish Government Research Fellow at the University of Oxford and has previously held Research Ireland postdoctoral awards at the University College Cork and Trinity College Dublin. And she is currently Principal Investigator of the Research Ireland Pathways Project to Pregnancy and Giving Birth in Ireland from 1950 to 2020, based on the Department of History in Trinity College Dublin. So will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Deirdre Foley. Thank you.
Hi everyone, and thanks a million for coming this evening. Huge thanks also to Dublin City Council and particularly to Abigail for the invitation to speak. I've really loved doing this research. I'm kind of sad that for now it's over. I would just like to go back to it and do a lot more of it, hopefully in the future. But you might wonder, why, as a researcher, would I be so interested in women's work? And to answer that, I'd say that the everyday gendered experience of work reveals why women's labour was and still is different. It's been socially constructed in opposition to the perceived fixed norm of men's stabler, more lucrative careers. Women's working lives were and still are usually shorter than men's, often more sporadic, prone to change, precarious and segregated. Female workers in the period that I'm looking at this evening were not typically permanent members of the labour force. They tended to go out to work while they were young or in times of need and return to home life if circumstances improved. These differences survive now on a slightly less pronounced basis, particularly for women with children or other caring responsibilities. We're still feeling and kind of reeling from the impact, actually, of women's huge transition from the home to the labour market across the 20th century. And it's for these reasons that to analyse the distinct and separate treatment of women in the Irish workplace is actually really essential in order for us to understand the history and persistence of unequal pay. So, Jacobs is remembered by many Dubliners as a benevolent employer, a place where you would want to work. The Quaker-run factory was established on Bishop Street in 1853. It was an early example of welfare capitalism. So by this I mean the kind of added extras. Employees had bathing facilities, a roof garden, night classes, sports, social clubs, and access, albeit for a fee, to a doctor, a dentist, and a canteen. So the company's concern with welfare was innovative, but it was nevertheless paternalist and profit-driven, with the view to forging a loyal and healthy workforce in a city where housing and sanitation were, of course, notoriously poor. Now, motoring ahead of myself, excuse me. Yeah. This group is taken from the 1911 census. It gives us an insight into the living conditions of women and girls working at Jacobs. So I can only isolate 18 females in the 1911 census who definitely worked there, because these are the only ones who actually wrote the word Jacobs as well as their job. So something like factory hand at Jacobs. And many more obviously worked there, but they might have written something like bakery on the census return, so they can't be isolated as definitely employed by Jacobs. And for this reason, I'm really looking forward to finding Jacobs employees in the 1926 census when that comes out next month, because that census, unlike the previous one, asked people to specifically name their employer as well as their job. So it'll be far easier then to identify Jacobs workers. Now, in this sample, female Jacobs employees' households made up one of an average of 6 households per building. And each employee was one of an average of 27 total occupants of their building. So you're looking at tenement housing. The average household size from this sample was 5.7 persons. These households occupied an average of 1.6 rooms in inner city tenement or corporation housing. Women and girls came to Jacobs then from urban addresses. Their commute wasn't long, typically an average of 12 minutes walk from the factory. 95% came from households where female labour accounted for 50% or more of the total household income. 50% were orphaned or had a deceased father, so there was a necessity for them to generate income. So what was it like to work in Jacobs in this period? About just over 2,000 women were working in the factory in 1913 on a 50-hour, 5.5-day week. Work for women and girls, who were 66% of all employees, their work ranged from baking, tin making and washing to finishing, icing and packing baked goods. And that gender ratio remained really stable over the decades. In the mid-1960s, women and girls were 64% of all employees. So what's this high proportion of women workers all about? It was a result of cheaper wages and the unskilled nature of manual labour in the factory. Where men and boys were employed by Jacobs, they were paid more than their female colleagues. So in 1913, Jacobs women and girls earned between 4 and 8 shillings per week, but the rate for men and boys was between 12 and 28 shillings. So to offer a comparative from white-collar employment, in 1914, the weekly wage of a male typist in the civil service was 30 shillings. Wages were generally far lower for women to ensure their reliance on a husband's or father's income, all part of the male breadwinner model. So while women were certainly key contributors to the household income, they didn't have the status or the power of a male breadwinner. The lesser wage also represented what was generally, as I've mentioned, a shorter career for most women who for decades were obliged to leave the factory when they married. Now, it was also very easy to pay female employees very little when they came to the factory so young, and their pay was also structured by age. So taking a sample of 10 employee files of women who started work in Jacobs mostly around the 1910s, I found that the average age of a new starter was 15 and a half. They were very young girls when they started, so young that their parents had to give permission for their daughter to attend the factory's doctor or dentist. So this permission slip is in nearly every employee file. And you'll see from how I discuss and show these files this evening that I can't share personal data, obviously, and where I do name women from the Jacobs files, I've mostly changed their names. So every personnel file took details of employees' parents and siblings, whether they were alive or dead, employed or unemployed. I've kind of puzzled as to why this was, and I think it might have been about figuring out in lean times who to let go of first. That's at least a generous assessment as to why they were so heavily monitoring people. So if any of you here have a descendant who worked in Jacobs, you can request to view their file in the Dublin City Library and Archive on Pearse Street, or maybe you'd like to see your own file. So women's income from the factory was not only low, but also precarious. Notes scribbled on employee files demonstrate temporary seasonal employment, usually for the Christmas rush. So you can see people being let go and re-engaged here. Now, there was evidently, from my reading of the files, a really strict atmosphere of frequent discipline. We can see from the files what Jacobs girls got into trouble for on the factory floor. The incidents reported here span the late 30s to the 50s. So one was reprimanded for reading her paper and allowing another girl to go behind her counter to read. The same girl got in trouble for powdering her face, having stopped work early, and for wearing her hair untidily under her cap. Probably the most frequent reprimand that I've seen throughout many files is for careless packing of biscuits. So one employee was eventually suspended for this, but was in trouble again a couple of months later for, as her file says, packing very dirty ginger nut. So Jacobs is a huge part of the story of the Irish Revolution. Of course, as the building was a key outpost for Republicans during the 1916 Rising. The factory was chosen as a site of insurrection, not only for its strength as a military outpost, it made sense, it's a fortress, but also with wider ideological motives in mind. So socialist Republicans were really conscious of the Jacobs factory's lengthy participation in the 1913 lockout. They were also really critical of the firm's activity in the drive for recruitment to the British Army. So they encouraged male employees to enlist and to go to the front. And they also derived a lot of profit from manufacturing supplies for the front in that period. So, you know, there's a legitimate anti-imperialist critique of this activity. During Easter week, the Jacobs garrison was led by Thomas McDonagh, and reinforcements from the women were led by Maura Kuvelik, a senior member of Cumann na mBan, the Women's Republican Organisation. Now, Maura was also an actress and had been heavily involved in the early days of the Abbey Theatre. Her memoir, The Splendid Years, is a great read, and it's in this book that she sets out her recollections of 1916 really vividly. Arriving at the factory with about half a dozen Cumann na mBan girls, she witnessed a huge crowd of poorly dressed men and women, she wrote, some of them shouting and screaming and waving fists at the volunteers who had occupied the building. The protesters, she wrote, were a mixed crowd of Jacobs factory employees and separation allowance women. These women were the wives of soldiers fighting in the First World War who were angry because they weren't going to be able to collect that separation allowance. So Maura and her colleagues met with Thomas McDonagh, who was in charge of the garrison, and of course would later be executed for this. McDonagh, as you can see, hadn't really anticipated women's presence at the factory, but welcomed them anyway. A copy of the Proclamation of the Republic was brought to the factory and the Republican flag was hoisted from the roof. The women were in charge of feeding the 150 or so volunteers and found plenty of biscuits for this purpose, as well as a slab of chocolate which they used to make cocoa. And it's in a few of the files in the military archives. This sounds great, but they got sick of it quite quickly and sent out for a bit of meat and veg. So when those extra provisions arrived, they provided tea, sandwiches and stew, the women did, and also administered first aid to the injured. So you might say this is typical women's work, but it was also dangerous as sniping and street fighting are happening all around the building. Kathleen Lane, later McCarthy, was one of the women under Moore's command in Jacobs. Her military service pension collection application recalled her duties as attending to the needs of the garrison and providing first aid. She had been a member of the Kathleen Ní Houlihan branch of Cumann in Fairview since 1915. I always loved that extra detail of what branch they were a part of, you know, where they went to in Dublin City for their meetings. I think it really adds colour. So she'd been a member of the Fairview branch since 1915, and this reference was provided by Maureen Cuveley for Kathleen's military service pension application. Other women like Nellie Gifford and Christina Caffrey, who were members of the Irish Citizen Army, Eilidh O'Hanrahan, the sister of Michael, Ellen Bushell, Annie Carey and Anya Malone of Cumann, among others, were intermittently present at the factory as messengers. Anya Malone was shot in the hip en route to Jacobs with a message from St. Stephen's Green. And throughout the city, obviously injuries were not exclusive to rebels. A 29-year-old Jacobs factory forewoman, Margaret Nolan, was fatally caught in the crossfire. She was shot in the head at the door of Berkeley Street Church in Phibsborough, and she died in the Mater Hospital. Now, another Jacobs employee was affected by the rising in a different way, as she was due to be married then. She could well have been part of the angry crowd that greeted Maura and her fellow Cumann women. So Angela had worked at the factory since 1913. And in the run-up to Easter 1916, she was 18 and engaged to be married. The wedding was originally planned to take place on the 30th of April in Marlborough Street Church, but as her file notes, she was not married then owing to the Sinn Féin rebellion in the city. So the postponement of her marriage must have caused Angela some stress, as she'd already handed in her notice at work, as was the custom, but also the company's rule. But she was given leave to stay on until closer to her new wedding date in early June 1916. And even, you know, the choice of June shows us maybe how much upheaval there was at that time. She didn't feel optimistic enough maybe to have it in May. Angela was married 2 days after she left the factory, but you'll see that her profession already didn't warrant recording in the marriage cert. So these kinds of official documents tell us so much about how women's labour has been categorised and undervalued by the state and society. My own birth certificate doesn't record my mother's profession, and I'm very young. So some of Jacobs' female employees were themselves revolutionaries too. Susan Ryan and her half-sisters, who were called Lizzie and Nellie Merrigan, all worked at Jacobs, and they belonged to the Colmkill branch of Cumann on Blackhall Street. So Susan had started at Jacobs in 1913. 3 years into her employment, she made the most of the cancellation of work because of the rising. She was 22 and she wasn't a member of Cumann yet, but she helped at North King Street, cooking and providing accommodation to the volunteers who erected a barricade close to her home on Church Street. So similarly, her half-brother Thomas spontaneously joined the barricade and later became a member of the Irish Volunteers. So you get a good glimpse here of how people kind of got involved in republicanism as well. So Susan engaged in the usual coming amon activities, attending meetings and first aid classes, visiting prisoners, canvassing and working for the 1918 election. So the family home, 58 Church Street, was frequently used as a safe house, a meeting place and an arms dump. Susan's duties throughout the War of Independence included helping men on the run, moving and hiding arms in the house. Susan was romantically involved with and became engaged to IRA member Michael Kennedy, who frequently stayed at Church Street, and he brought 6 revolvers to the house on the day of Bloody Sunday after the shootings in the morning. During the Civil War, Susan and her siblings fought on the anti-treaty side. While she continued to work in Jacobs by day, by night she transported guns and ammunition regularly for attacks. In 1922, she assisted at 2 attacks on Broadstone Railway Station and other ambushes on Bolton Street and Mount Street. The Civil War also caused the breakup of her engagement to Michael, who was pro-treaty. And I should say as well, you can probably see that Susan is in the middle in the group shot here, and that's one of her sisters, Nellie. Let's see, sorry, breakup over the Civil War. Where was I? Her sister Nellie's engagement ended for the same reason, the split over the treaty. Nellie was pro-treaty. Susan was arrested at home in February 1923 and she was interned for 8 months during the big crackdown on coming amon women during the Civil War. Lizzie and Nellie were arrested a month later at work in the factory in Jacobs, and they were arrested by Nellie's former fiancé, who was now a National Army soldier. So this was personal. The 3 sisters were some of over 600 anti-treaty women who were imprisoned in the North Dublin Union during the Civil War. The sisters all participated in hunger strike and were released in October 1923. Now, obviously, they hadn't been at work for quite a while. Susan, after her release, struggled because Jacobs initially refused to re-employ her. She wrote on her military service application, her pension application, after internment in 1923, was refused reinstatement at my work after 10 years service, 4 years as charge hand, junior supervisory role at £2 per week. After 9 months on the dole, I was re-employed at 26 shillings per week with loss of service. So she had essentially been demoted. So as a woman who resisted the Anglo-Irish Treaty, she was likely dubbed a subversive by her employer. Her position was in direct opposition to that of the new Irish Free State. Jacobs were also mindful of the memory of the losses incurred during Easter 1916, for which they had received compensation of almost £3,000 from the British state. So eventually Susan was rehired at Jacobs. This is always a pattern. They frequently take people back. It was the same after the lockout because it was easier than having to train someone new, right? But she was rehired as a new hand with loss of service and reduced wages. But her employment wasn't to last much longer, as she married in 1926 and was then obliged to leave her work again. So this leads us on to the marriage bar. Now, the exclusion of married women from many avenues of work was a central element of Irish women's working lives for decades. And this custom was definitely not uniquely Catholic nor Irish. It was certainly long-lasting in Catholic Ireland. So Ireland's civil service marriage bar originated under the British administration from the 1870s, but it was lifted comparatively late in 1973 after independence. Most other states had gotten rid of the marriage bar by then. And you could say that in Ireland, this ideal of the male breadwinner was bolstered and preserved by the growth of Catholic social values as the new state developed. So while this wasn't a new policy after independence, The marriage bar was one of a series of legislative measures in the early decades of the Irish Free State, which really limited the participation of women in the public sphere, emphasising their duties in the home, as described in the Constitution, as wives and mothers. This ideology had a really long-lasting effect. In 1961, just 5% of married women were in the official labour force, according to the census. Now, a lot of research primarily associates the marriage bar with clerical or white-collar work. However, the rule also applied for many years in industrial firms like Sunbeam, Wolseley and Ford's down in Cork, and in Dublin in Guinness and Jacobs. So a 1938 memo from the Jacobs staff handbook outlined the process for women leaving the factory for marriage. So this was imposed as a rule with no exceptions for decades. And I also don't think they really adjusted the payment with inflation, at least not often enough. So those with 3 years and above of service were entitled to a wedding cake. With 6 years of service, they also received £1, rising to £2 with 10 years of service. To qualify for these benefits, girls, as they're referred to, had to give at least a week's notice and also evidence from their clergyman stating that they were due to marry. So you couldn't fake this. Now, there's a special type of record. Matrimony books in the Jacobs collection record the departure of thousands of women from their jobs in the factory for marriage. As I've said, I can't really share a lot of personal data with this, but I do have permission to say that I found Luke Kelly of the Dubliners' mother, Julia Fleming, in this. So she married in December 1934 with over 11 years of service working as a tin washer, which I've read was probably one of the most uncomfortable parts of the factory, very hot, you had to wear clogs, and the floor would have been slippy, etc. Now, her husband, Luke Sr., also worked at Jacobs, but he obviously got to keep his job. And next we have a case of a concealed marriage. A girl who I'll call Mary Smith started work in Jacobs at 14 in 1913 as a packer and finisher. In March 1922, when she was 23, she married John Dunn, an English soldier who was in the 2nd Battalion of the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry. So John had survived service throughout the First World War, having joined up in 1914. After time in India and Iraq after the war, John's battalion was posted to Ireland from 1921 to 1922, which seems to be when he met his future wife. This is the last period, of course, in which British troops were in the 26 counties. The handover of power took place very near to us now in Dublin Castle in January 1922, after the signature of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in the December 1921. Now, I can only speculate as to why Mary concealed her marriage to John at work. It could have been shame, as the attitude towards British occupation was obviously at an all-time high, or she may well just have been practical. In 1922, her husband was redeployed to occupied Germany, so why shouldn't she keep working while he was away? She lived with her parents on Wood Street, 5 minutes walk from the factory. But she was reprimanded for this by her superiors at Jacobs, as is detailed extensively on her file. As it was rumoured persistently that this girl had been married, her supervisor, Miss Ormiston, interviewed her. She denied emphatically the truth of these reports. Several weeks later, however, having again heard the same report on most reliable authority, Miss Ormiston sent for Mary on the 15th of September 1922. She was obliged to admit that she had been married since the 16th of March, and that her previous statement was untruthful. She was paid off that day and given 1 week's wages in lieu of notice. So Mary did settle in Dublin, as there's records of her children's birth in Dublin, and her husband's death cert also gives the address of the original family home in Wood Street. So she was never far away from the factory. In Jacobs, some married women were hired back, usually on temporary part-time contracts from the 1930s onwards, where there was demand for their labour. So usually, for example, in the run-up to Christmas. Jacobs' policy for married women really, I think, demonstrates the narrower and less reliable pool of employment options that remained open for many women after they got married. And this is sadly really evident in the record of one woman, who we'll call Anya. She started working at Jacobs in 1918 at 16. I found her also at the age of 8 in the 1911 census at the same address she gave when she joined the factory, which was in the North Inner City. Her family of 6 had a single room in an 8-room tenement house occupied by them and 6 other families, totaling 22 people in the North Inner City. She also, I think somewhat romantically, grew up next door to her future husband, who was living in similar housing next door with his family all in one room. So in 1919, Anya suffered a workplace accident with a press machine. And this is the type of machine that she had the accident on, whereby 2.5 of the fingers of her right hand had to be amputated. And this happened while she was working in the tin making section of Jacobs. Now, the factory offered her £75 compensation, which was later raised to £100 in court in 1920 due to the Workmen's Compensation Act. And people would have been aware of their rights under this act and would have kind of pressed for more. The court also stated that Jacobs should give the girl every chance at work, and this was also recorded on her employee file. Her work record was fairly average in comparison with colleagues, with a few reprimands, the usual kind, for careless packaging of biscuits and chocolates. Anya left Jacobs in 1922 to be married, but she made contact with them again in 1931, writing from an Ivy Trust housing address on Bride Street. Now, her brother-in-law worked for Guinness, so Anya and her family may have been living with him. Her letters to Jacobs offer us a very rare insight into a working class woman's experience and most importantly, her opinion of the marriage bar. Dear Madam, having learned that employment is now being given to married women in Jacobs, I respectfully beg to apply for a position. I was employed up to 22 as an assorted chocolate packer. When I married in 22, I was very reluctantly forced to leave under the rule which made all women do so on their marriage. During my employment, I met with an accident which entailed the loss of 3 fingers. An order was made by the court that employment was to be provided for me by Jacobs as long as I liked to remain. The loss of my fingers is now in no way a handicap and would not prevent me doing my work in a satisfactory manner. I earnestly beg that sympathetic consideration be given to my application. Now, the reply that she got stated that a few extra married women have been engaged temporarily this year to help Jacobs with their Christmas trade, but they didn't require any further help, and that they would bear her application in mind for the future. Now, sometime later, Anya tried her luck again, writing from a different address in the inner city. And the escalating tone of urgency here will be familiar to anyone who's ever had to scramble applying for work and social welfare. Job applications like these were part of the mixed economy of welfare and also part of the enormous mental load negotiated by women in poverty. I'd be very grateful if you could secure a vacancy for me, as I'm in need of help at present, owing to my husband being out of employment. I applied to you some time ago and received an answer for which I was very thankful. So, dear madam, if you could consider my case, I would be very grateful. Sometimes people are surprised to hear how eloquent this sort of writing is from a working class person, but this was an acquired skill. as I've said, in terms of negotiating poverty and standing up for yourself. So it shouldn't actually surprise us at all. So she wrote again from another address from the Ivy Trust House again in 1934. I'm now in very poor circumstances as I have a large family and my husband is unemployed. If it were possible to obtain this temporary employment, it would indeed help me and my children very much. Now, it's noted in annotations on the letters received by Jacobs that Anya was missing fingers, and that while they did interview her in 1934, her old injury appears to actually be the reason why she was never successful in securing work with them again. They wrote that there was no suitable vacancy. Now, systematic new hires of married women who hadn't previously worked at Jacobs didn't occur until possibly the 70s. So really, it was to the advantage of the company to have experienced former staff at their disposal for a low wage and on a temporary basis. The first employee handbook that doesn't specify the marriage bar was printed around 1967, but it still outlined that procedure for women who chose to resign when marrying. So this shows us the blurriness between policy and culture when it comes to the marriage bar. Where it wasn't an enforced rule, women might also just take it upon themselves because of how much of a cultural norm it was. It was culturally desirable for families to subsist on the wage of a male breadwinner, which, of course, as Anya showed us, wasn't always possible. Now, marriage, of course, wasn't the only reason why women left their jobs at Jacobs. This chart shows us many other reasons alongside marriage. It's compiled from a book of records of women departing from Jacobs from 1967 to 68. So the reasons are grouped thematically here. To begin with, we have leaving for a new job. The second most common reason was emigration, mostly to England, followed by marriage, and then personal or domestic reasons, which usually meant other care work within the family due to the illness or death of parents or other family members. So this is also a huge reason for how transitory women were in the labour market. No matter the truth of the reasons for their departure, because I'm sure some of these women were fibbing or maybe didn't want to divulge personal information to their employer. Within these records are hundreds of personal stories and hardships. It's hard not to kind of speculate of family tragedies, episodes of depression, homesickness, pregnancy outside of marriage, disability, illness and poverty. And it's something that I didn't see in any record was any mention of pregnancy or fertility at all, which is remarkable for such a fertile cohort, right? So some other interesting reasons given by women for their departure included training to be an actress, being too hot or too tired, going to do sewing or hairdressing, and a few even joined the Women's Royal Army Corps during the Second World War in England. So while women's paid labour was really enmeshed with their unpaid care work, the personal or domestic category really shows how one could take priority over another very suddenly, even for unmarried women, especially when their work was seen as more dispensable than men's. There's remarks in individual files that give us a better idea of women's reasons for leaving and their personal cases. One young woman was essentially swapping roles with her mother, who was going back to work, so she was now needed at home. Another left because her mother was unwell, and she wrote expressing her regret. I liked the work and felt that I was doing well. My mother is not feeling well and requires my help for a while. So, as I start to finish up here, by the 1970s, marriage bars were increasingly circumvented. The Civil Service Employment of Married Women Bill 1973, or Act 1973, removed the bar in state employment, but this had no effect on any marriage bar observed in the private sector. So, as I've mentioned already, the first employee handbook that doesn't specify the bar as a rule was produced around 1967, but it still outlined that procedure. Jacob's matrimony records stop in August 1977. So women had the option of taking the marriage gratuity payment or cake until then. But for many women, it was still a custom, if not a rule. And maybe even if they had wanted to stay, maybe it wasn't something that their husbands would countenance. The Employment Equality Act applied from July 1977. So this new legislation banned marriage bars in the private sector, and it also banned any stipulation of gender or marital status in ads for new posts. So this power of an employer to stipulate age and gender was really meaningful. And it's important to consider how this helped to kind of segregate and further limit female employment. And also drive wages down. This is equally evident in the trend towards part-time as well as full-time employment for married women, which is really visible in these job ads from the 1960s onwards. Claudia Golden is a Harvard economic historian who won the Nobel Prize in 2023. She's shown that the gender pay gap is present in almost all occupations because of the value that's placed on the hours and the job continuity of workers. And research shows that employment equality legislation obviously did not fully eradicate pay differences between men and women. And the disparity is often greater in terms of weekly pay because this figure might include factors like overtime and bonus, more commonly accrued by men who are more likely to work longer hours. Another significant factor for unequal pay has been how segregated the Irish labour market is. And for women in Dublin, this was evident in cleaning and light industrial work, for example, where women were persistently concentrated in particular occupations or sectors, with men in others, with women in lower grade jobs and men in the higher ones. So to finish up now, if you're interested in learning more about Jacobs, I would definitely first have a look at the photographic archive, which is available on the Digital Repository of Ireland. So if you just search for Jacobs on dri.ie, it's where I got all of the factory photos that you've just seen. You can also visit the Jacobs archive by appointment at the Dublin City Library and Archive over on Pearse Street. And finally, I'm going to plug my own article on which this talk is based, which you can find in SAHER, the Irish Labour History Society Journal. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.